Nobody ever suspected where that quiet housekeeper had found the money needed for the little girl's emergency surgery, a huge sum that seemed to appear out of nowhere on the very day doctors said there was no more time to lose. It would take 2 full years before the millionaire discovered that the money had come from a loan taken at a devastating interest rate from a loan shark in her neighborhood, a debt the housekeeper had quietly paid off month after month, out of her own salary, sacrificing meals, her own medication, and every last shred of personal comfort, just so little girl could keep seeing the light of the sun. Cold April rain fell over Craiova that evening, beating hard against the large windows of the villa on Unirii Street, where Bogdan Marinescu lived, a 42-year-old man, owner of a pharmacy chain more than 30 locations across southern Romania. A business he had built starting from a single pharmacy and from his mother, a woman who had worked her entire life as a pharmacist in a modest part of the city, expanded over 16 years of tireless work, risky, well-calculated investments, and an almost obsessive dedication to professional success, to a respected chain with dozens of employees and solid contracts with major pharmaceutical distributors nationwide. In the eyes of the Oltenia business community, Bogdan was a picture of success, a man who had gone from a neighborhood pharmacy to considerable wealth, but his personal life hid a quiet, constant dread tied to the health of his daughter, Larissa, 6 years old, diagnosed at just 3 years of age with a rare form of retinal degeneration, a progressive disease that threatened to leave her completely blind if the necessary treatment wasn't administered in time, an invisible sword of Damocles hanging over every single day of that family's life. Bogdan had been divorced for 2 years from Larissa's mother, Corina, unable to cope with the constant emotional pressure caused by a daughter's illness, as well as a marriage by Bogdan's frequent absence. Almost constantly consumed by running his business, had decided, shortly after Larissa's fall for divorce, quickly remarrying a man, she marrying a business trip and moving permanently to Spain, essentially leaving full custody of the little girl to Bogdan, an arrangement Corina justified at the time as wanting to give Larissa stability, but which Bogdan silently interpreted as a form of abandonment, a wound he never openly discussed with anyone, not even his closest friends. Left alone with the full responsibility of raising her with special medical needs, Bogdan, almost constantly busy running his business, traveling frequently by pharmacy chains, 30 locations, negotiating with suppliers, managing numerous staff, attending and ran late into the evening, schedule that kept him away from home most of the day, had hired 3 years earlier a housekeeper to look after Larissa and the household, a decision made out of practical necessity, but one that would over time become one of the most important decisions of his life. Without him realizing, at the time of hiring her, the depth of the impact that woman would have on his family. Nicoleta Barbu was 40 years old and had worked for the Marinescu family for nearly 3 woman, her posture slightly stooped from hard physical labor. Originally from a modest part of Craiova known for difficult living conditions and high unemployment, her personal life marked constant financial hardship and a pain she carried every day, almost invisible to those around her. Her son, Maria, struggled with drug addiction for nearly 8 years, a devastating reality she had gradually discovered through the increasing obvious signs of young man's physical and behavioral deterioration, through a series of small thefts from the house, through sudden disappearances lasting days at a time, through desperate phone calls received at impossible hours of the night. Before I continue, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Nicoleta frequently spent from her modest housekeeper's salary to help Marius get through various crises, sometimes paying debts the young man had accumulated, other times buying him food when he showed up at her door, weak and disoriented after long periods of disappearing, never quite managing to pull him completely out of that vicious cycle of addiction. Despite repeated efforts to convince him to accept specialized help, an overwhelming emotional and financial burden she never discussed with her employer, considering it a strictly personal matter that had no place in her professional relationship with the Marinescu family. Over the 3 years she worked in that house, Nicoleta had become far more than a simple employee to Larissa, developing a deep, almost maternal bond with the little girl, being the one who took her to every scheduled ophthalmology appointment, sometimes twice a month, at specialized clinics in Craiova and occasionally in Bucharest, the one who administered her prescribed eye drops at fixed hours, a strict regimen that allowed no deviation, the one who soothed her on nights when the little girl woke up frightened, crying, trembling voice whether she would ever be able to see her favorite cartoons again, the characters from the TV shows she loved so much, or her own father's face. Bogdan, though financially present, making sure all treatment and medical checkup costs were covered without hesitation, remained emotionally distant, delegating almost entirely the daily management of his daughters to Nicoleta, satisfied with brief updates received in the evening through a text or a quick conversation at dinner. How was the checkup today? Did she take her drops? Functional, practical questions that rarely delved into the full emotional depth of what Larissa was through every day, the constant fear of darkness, the anxiety before medical. The fragile joy of every day. Her vision seemed stable. About 2 years earlier, Larissa's condition had suddenly worsened over just a few weeks, doctors noticing an accelerated deterioration, much faster than initially anticipated, and specialists at a private hospital in Bucharest, after a series of urgent consultations and additional tests, with a gravity that turned blood to ice, that there was only one viable solution to prevent complete blindness, an experimental surgery available only at a specialized clinic in Istanbul, Turkey, one of the few medical institutions in the region offering that innovative procedure at an estimated cost of over €25,000, which had to be performed within a maximum of 3 weeks to have any real chance of success. Otherwise, the risk of complete, irreversible blindness became almost certain, an extremely narrow window of time that allowed no hesitation. Bogdan, facing this enormous cost at a time when his company's liquidity was almost entirely tied up in a major expansion investment for the farmers chain, an ambitious project to open 10 new locations in Oltenia, Montania, with the money already allocated, signed through contracts with some property owners, impossible to recover quickly without considerable contractual penalties that would seriously damage his reputation with business partners, found himself facing unexpected, devastating financial pressure, which he carefully hid from the rest of the family, from his business partners, even from Nicoleta, borrowing in desperation from 2 different banks, using personal properties as collateral, but managing, despite frantic efforts over just a few days, to gather only about half of the amount needed in time for the surgery. Those nights became a constant torment for Bogdan, who stayed up late, talking on the phone with managers, accountants, lawyers, desperately trying to fast financing solution, without managing to find a legal, quick way to raise the missing amount within the critical time frame set by the doctors, a desperation he tried to hide from Larissa, but which the little girl, with the intuition of a child already used to tension in the house, sensed perfectly, asking her father one evening why he looked so sad, a question Bogdan couldn't find an honest answer. Nicoleta, a daily witness to Bogdan's growing desperation, to the nights she heard him on the phone with banks and accountants through the half-open office door, to her associates as she sensed the tension building in the house, without fully understanding the real reason behind it, asking Nicoleta, in a whisper, "Auntie Nicoleta, will I be able to see on my birthday in 3 months?" Made on a night in March, an extreme decision, driven by the deep love she had developed for that little girl over 3 years of daily care, a love that had long since crossed the boundaries of a purely professional relationship, turning into an almost maternal bond, fueled perhaps also by her own pain over being unable to save her son from his own devastating addiction. Having no savings of her own, completely drained over the years by constant expenses related to her son's problems, but desperate to find a quick solution for Larissa, categorically refusing the idea by passively while a little girl she deeply loved risked losing her sight forever, Nicoleta went early one morning to a loan shark known in her neighborhood, a man named Sandu, known in the community for offering quick loans with no formal guarantees, no complicated bureaucratic checks, but with an exorbitant interest rate, almost 20% a month, an extremely risky type of loan. Known as a financial trap few managed to escape without devastating long-term consequences. She borrowed the missing amount, nearly €13,000, signing with a trembling hand a strict monthly payment agreement, with severe penalties for any delay, which would consume in the following months almost half of her modest housekeeper's salary, an immense financial burden. Without hesitation, fully aware of the risks she was taking, but believing there was no other viable option the time remaining, later presenting the money to Bogdan under the pretext of an unexpected inheritance from a distant aunt in Oltenia, whom she hadn't been in contact with years. A simple but believable lie that Bogdan, overwhelmed by almost indescribable relief and the devastating emotion of his daughter's critical situation, accepted without asking further questions. too focused on quickly arranging the trip to Turkey to stop and examine the exact details of that explanation. The surgery succeeded at the clinic in Istanbul, under the guidance of a specialized medical team, and Larissa gradually regained, over the following months of recovery, much of her visual capacity, doctors declaring the result a remarkable success, far beyond initial expectations, news that brought overwhelming joy to the Marinescu household, Bogdan crying with happiness for the first time since his divorce, holding his daughter tightly in the hospital room in Istanbul. For 2 full years, Nicoleta had continued in silence to pay the monthly installments to the loan shark, a suffocating financial burden that often forced her paying other essential personal expenses, utility bills, the rent on her own modest apartment, sometimes refusing to buy her own medication for the high blood pressure she had managed for years, just to pay the installments on time and avoid the severe penalties imposed by Sandu, a financial and physical suffering completely hidden behind her calm smile every morning, behind her constant dedication to the Marinescu family, with no one in that house ever suspecting the true scale of the sacrifice she made every single day. The truth came to light one summer afternoon, almost 2.5 years after the surgery, when Sandu, the loan shark, unhappy about a minor delay of a few days in an installment payment, caused by an unexpected expense to a new crisis with her son, showed up directly at the gate of the Marinescu villa, in an aggressive manner, loudly and threateningly demanding money from Nicoleta right at the gate, at the exact moment Bogdan was arriving from work, getting out of his car and becoming a direct witness to that unexpected, completely shocking street confrontation. Bogdan, intervening immediately, confused and alarmed by the stranger's aggressive tone, demanded an explanation, and Nicoleta, overwhelmed with shame and fear, but realizing there was no longer any way to hide the truth, was forced to reveal everything right there at the gate, her voice trembling with emotion and humiliation, telling the story of the loan taken 2 years earlier, the real reason behind that desperate decision, and the inheritance lie told to protect Bogdan from additional worry at an already extremely difficult moment. Bogdan was left completely stunned, unable to immediately process the magnitude of this revelation, looking at Nicoleta with a devastating mix of overwhelming gratitude and deep shame, realizing, in a split second, the real sacrifice behind that unexpected inheritance mentioned 2 years earlier, a sacrifice that had saved his daughter from blindness, paid for out of the non-existent savings of a woman who could barely make ends meet financially, made even worse by a devastating loan shark interest rate. He immediately paid off, that very evening, the entire remaining debt to the loan shark, paying Sandu directly, with a generous sum that included a compensation to make sure the man would never come back to harass Nicoleta again. Then in the days that followed insisted, despite Nicoleta's repeated emotional refusals, as she felt ashamed and believed she didn't deserve such generosity, on fully repaying every sum she had paid to loan shark, calculated with interest included, plus a considerable additional amount, equivalent to almost a year's salary, as a concrete form of gratitude for her extraordinary sacrifice. Furthermore, Bogdan hired, entirely at his own expense, a specialized addiction counselor and a long-term recovery program for Marius, Nicoleta's son, giving him a real chance at rehabilitation his mother had never been able to afford, a gesture that moved Nicoleta deeply, bringing her tears of gratitude she hadn't shed in a long time, overwhelmed by the thought that, perhaps, finally, there was real hope for her son. Larissa, now 8 years old, seeing well enough to draw simple but detailed portraits of her family members, drew Nicoleta with a big heart above her head, writing beneath it, in clumsy but heartfelt child's handwriting, "You are my angel who sees for me," a drawing Bogdan framed and placed in a place of honor in his office, a permanent reminder of the silent sacrificer who had chosen, without hesitation, to risk her own financial stability for the sight of a child who wasn't hers, proving that the true wealth of the heart is never measured in bank accounts. In quiet acts done out of pure, unconditional love.